called debt negotiations. And I do remember when Barack Obama was around, really sort of being forced to restore some of the Bush tax cuts in order to come to an agreement on raising the debt ceiling. You know, uh, under former President Trump, we raised the debt ceiling by $10 trillion, just under him. And then with the Bush era tax cuts, the unpaid for wars, we have really increased the debt a lot for things like that. The the question I guess I have for you, Dr. Edelberg, is have the tax cuts that have promised so much in terms of trickle down and in terms of revenue raising, have they been commensurate with the GDP, with the growth in GDP?
So the tax cuts that were in the 2017 Tax Act on net increased the deficit by about $2 trillion.
All right, so the claims that they just somehow just lifted our country have not borne themselves out yet. All right, the question that I have for you, Mr. Dutta Gupta, you said, I'm just trying to recall what you said about the United States being 39 out of 42 in the OECD countries in terms of, you talked about it in terms of work requirements. Can you please remind me of what you said?
Absolutely, Congresswoman Moore. So in terms of the share of jobs that are considered low paid or low wage jobs among high income and some middle income countries in the OECD, the United States ranks very close to the bottom. So we have a very large share of jobs that do not pay well in this country.
So, so when we start talking about work requirements as a solution to our spending problems, forcing people into the low wage workforce, is that not a solution toward?
Well, it turns out it doesn't even do that. So it doesn't really do much to increase employment and earnings. You're going to mostly kick people off essential benefits like Medicaid, SNAP, and TANF, who actually could benefit from those programs and then do better in the labor market.
Thank you. And so, Mr. Mulvaney, I was very eager to hear your testimony, given your tremendous role that you have played in our government. And I was really surprised to hear that you thought that the downgrade of S&P in 2011 was related to just uncertainty and not directly related to the brinksmanship. I can't think of any other word. The Government Accounting Office says that $1.3 billion just in that 1 year, it cost us in increased borrowing costs. The Bipartisan Policy Center said that in the 10-year cost would be $18.9 billion. And GOA also found that in 2013, the federal government borrowing cost increased by 38 to 70 million. And I could go on, but my time would expire. And I do want to give you an opportunity to respond to this. I do understand that confidence is a really big part of investing, but doesn't it seem curious to you that for the very first time in history that this occurred after this brinksmanship?
No, because I read the report.
They said it was because of partisan
Mr. Schweikert's got the language. I mean, you could look at it. Yes, it actually does. It mentions a bunch of different things, but the narrative has become that it was because of the brinksmanship, and that's just false.
Okay.
They did mention the fact that Congress couldn't get along. There was dysfunction in Washington, D.C., and that was concerning to them.
Well, it was a curious coincidence. Okay, I have 25 seconds left, and so I just want to point out, that one of the features of the bill that the Republicans are so proud that they passed regarding the debt ceiling includes repealing something like the Inflation Reduction Act, which in fact reduced our deficit by some $350 billion, if I'm remembering it correctly, something that the Republicans have not done, although they talk on and on and on about reducing deficits. President Biden and the Democrats have been the only ones who've done that. I just want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence, and I would yield back. And thank all of you all for your very candid answers.
Representative Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists. Again, it's been said many times here, but I think it's worth reiterating. We've done something to avoid the debt limit in the House, and we've passed a bill. And to my colleague, Mr. Smucker had a great comment. If you don't like that, we call on our senators to pass something else over here that we can then get into conference and move ahead. But we'll continue to do this, and the things that we did are common sense, thoughtful ways to get this country back on track. It's not final, but it's a step in the right direction. Encouraging people to go to work is pretty meaningful. Look, I've lived in a community where we saw the evisceration of a manufacturing base of the textile industry following NAFTA. And we saw a generation move into poverty and on government assistance. And it wasn't until actually we revitalized our area, brought in an automotive plant, and people went back to work that they actually got out of poverty. Okay? So jobs count, jobs matter, and getting people back engaged is important. Rescinding money for a pandemic that is no longer here and a public health emergency that has been declared over, that's pretty common sense, right? I mean, why would we keep that money there when the pandemic is over and that's what the money was for? Let's pull that back. And when you look at the spending levels that we're recommending, the first step of that is fiscal year 24 spending would be at fiscal year 22 levels, which is exactly where we are right now. And the world has not fallen apart. And I think when I look at where we are with our energy policy, it makes no sense to continue to burden and punish American families with high energy costs when there are some very thoughtful bipartisan things that we can do with permitting reform that makes sense to get our country back on track from an energy perspective. And then, when I look at those things, these are things that make sense to Americans. And by the way, putting in something like the RAINS Act, which simply says that if an agency puts in a regulation that has more than $100 million impact on the economy, we should have a say in that. It's pretty common sense stuff. These aren't draconian cuts. This isn't crazy stuff that folks have been talking about. But I think that the House plan is something that, again, to my colleagues on the Senate side, please send us something else. If you don't like that, sitting there saying a clean debt limit, if you can pass that, pass it. We'll have a discussion about it. But make no mistake, House Republicans have voted to raise the debt ceiling. We're just simply waiting on the rest of Washington to catch up with us. Mr. Mulvaney, we've heard a lot about raising revenue. One of the proposals in the president's budget, President Biden's budget, is to raise the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%. How much revenue would that raise over a 10-year period?
I have no idea. My guess is probably zero.
Okay. Dr. Edelberg, real quickly, you got a number of how much money that would raise, going from 21 to 28% over a decade? Is that $100 billion? Is that $1 trillion, 1.2 trillion?
I don't have the number with me, but there are certainly estimates out there.
Okay.
And I think that change was also proposed to be made alongside a host of other changes that would
I reclaiming my time. I'm just saying you're talking about raising revenue here, right?
that would raise revenue. Yes.
All right. So if we're talking about raising revenue and going up from 21 to 28%, probably raises what, about 1.2, 1.5 trillion dollars. I'm looking down at my colleague from Arizona who does a whole lot of math real quickly in his head, but it's probably about $1.5 trillion, right? So if we're asking our job creators and our innovators, our companies in America to pay a 28% rate in order to raise revenue, then why in the world would we turn around and allow them to escape their tax liability by giving them a $1.2 trillion green energy tax credit? Director Mulvaney, is this something that makes sense?
That's where I get you to zero. I mean, you're playing with tiny numbers. That's not the corporate tax doesn't generate enough money to worry about. It doesn't. Where's the money? The money is on income taxes on the middle class. That's where the money is, right? There's an old saying, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. If you're going to do this by raising taxes, you have to do it on the middle class. And nobody wants to do that. You shouldn't do that, right?
And the downside of doing that is it makes America less, of raising it on our job creators, is it makes us less competitive in the global
Which
economy.
also makes the middle class less able to pay taxes. So yeah,
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. So I am going to pass the gavel over to Representative Byer, who is going to preside as I go to the Senate floor to vote. Thank you. Representative, good to see you.
Senator, have a great time.
Well,
At least feels more normal.
it does, yeah. Thank you for being here, and I really appreciate it. It's been fascinating listening to you and also listening to my friends here on the dais. Director Mulvaney, I was fascinated by your comment that every time we get near a debt limit, we cry default, and every time we get to a budget omnibus, we cry shutdown. So let me make a couple of quick points and move on. Number one is there is a solution on Social Security. In fact, there are a number of solutions. The one that I'm favor is John Larson's Social Security 2100 that he's been pushing for a number of years that makes it viable through the end of the century and raises benefits for the people at the very lowest end. It does increase the 6.2% by a measly 0.04% per year over 25 years. So completely invisible to the taxpayer. The second thing is the tax surge. 2022 was very good for taxes, 19.2%. But you can ascribe an awful lot of that to the American Rescue Plan, to the economic impact payments, to the CARES Act, to the $800 billion unemployment insurance, and they've been falling pretty precipitously in 2023. The third point I'd like to make is we're 34th out of 38 in the OECD in terms of taxes to GDP. Our ratio is 26.6%. Theirs is 34.1 on average. And yet, American citizens want the same benefits that all those people in those OECD countries. We're not cutting back on the safety net. In fact, our safety net's smaller than most of those countries. And as Donald Trump points out again and again, it's difficult to touch that safety net. People don't want us to cut Social Security. They don't want us to cut Medicare. And he realizes it's the wrong thing to do, and he encourages all of our friends, Republican and Democrat, not to touch it. And then fourth, and Director, you know very well, the critical issue here is the mandatory spending. The Medicare, the Medicaid, Social Security, let's assume we can solve. And yet, with all that mandatory spending, we have the lowest lifespan of any of those OECD countries. We're failing our citizens. I look at the 17, 18% of our GDP that we're spending on healthcare, and what's the next highest? 12%. Most of them are 10 or 11%. We look at diabetes, where 25% of our Medicare budget, maybe it's 20, the last number I heard was 25%, is just on end-stage renal disease, just on diabetes treatment. We have dental care, which is terrible for most Americans with the consequent impact. Telehealth, big move forward in a bipartisan way. I'm very optimistic that artificial intelligence may give us a way to move forward on a lot of different of those healthcare issues. But now, let me move to my question. One party doesn't want any new revenue. The other party is critically aware that we don't want to cut any benefits. We had Simpson Bowles. You were there for that. Nice commission, 18 people. It needed 12 votes to approve it. We had 5 Democrats vote yes, 5 Republicans vote yes, 1 independent, but we couldn't get the last vote, and it didn't happen. So, Dr. Edelberg, here we are with a $31 trillion budget that's going way, deficit that's going to go way up, public debt. What do we do? How do we, in this difficult political world, what's the way forward?
There are a host of ideas. The problem here is not a shortage of ideas. There are many ideas for how most effectively to raise tax revenue while minimizing any kind of negative incentive effects. There's a whole host of ideas of where we can cut spending. I think one of the reasons why this is so politically challenging is that the direct economic effects of having higher debt are actually rather modest. So I believe the empirical models that show that higher debt as a share of GDP raises interest rates and crowds out private investment. But take take the significant reduction in debt as a share of GDP under the GOP's plan, the sign was put up. CBO's projections are that GNP per person will rise from $78,000 to $88,000 per person in 2022 dollars under the baseline through 2033. That very significant reduction in debt as a share of GDP would mean instead of rising to $88,000 per person, it will rise to $89,000 per person. These effects are moderate. And so the trade-offs are hard, and it makes the politics hard.
Thank you. My friend, Mr. Schweikers pointed out that Medicare, 31% of Medicare costs are diabetes right now. Astonishing. One last quick idea. I had dinner with Martin Wolf the other night from the Financial Times, who has been in his latest book, he's done a whole chapter to citizen juries. The idea that in our very polarized political world, it sometimes makes sense to go get a bunch of citizens randomly picked, put them together for a year studying the thing, and come up with a bipartisan, not even bipartisan, a citizen, and then present it to the Congress where we get to vote yes or no on it, as opposed to the eternal fights that we always seem to have.
I hate to interrupt, but wasn't there some famous American one time who said he'd rather be governed by a random selection of 400 people from the DC phone book than by the elected officials? Looking at Mr. Lee, who was that? It's a famous libertarian. I can't remember who it was. No.
With that, I yield back to myself and recognize Senator Lee.
You see the things you start.
I think it might have been Bob Murray. Not Bob Murray, Charles Murray.
I'll look it up while you're doing, but yeah, I think it was at Cato, but yeah, they'd rather be, no, it might have been, anyway.
Yeah, we'll think of it. All right, Mr. Mulvaney, let's start with you. Back when you were Congressman McMulvaney, which was awesome, in addition to the many other awesome hats you've worn, back in 2014, almost a decade ago, you had an exchange with then Treasury Secretary Jack Lew. Do you remember this? You had an exchange with him, which you're asking him some questions about why the government was pretending to lack the capacity to prioritize incoming revenue to ensure that the first money in the door went out the door to cover interest on debt. Do you remember this exchange?
I do.
Now, do you recall, and can you provide some thoughts as to why Democratic appointees in both the Obama administration and now the Biden administration, particularly in their Treasury departments, so consistently, so defiantly refuse to state that bondholders will be paid in full if, in fact, we go past the X date?
My professional opinion is that it's leveraged politically.
It's leveraged politically. Did they provide you an answer at the time?
I don't remember what the answer was.
But what you did not hear from them was any legal reason or any mathematical
correct.
reason or any financial reason why they couldn't and shouldn't, and under the 14th Amendment wouldn't already be required to, pay first those creditors whose payments have become due.
The explanation I've always heard, at least since, there used to be an argument back when I first got to Congress that it might not be legal, but I think we put that aside now. I heard Dr. Edelberg mention it, but I'm pretty sure there's a GAO report from the 80s that makes it clear it's okay to prioritize, at least it's legal. The argument I've heard ever since that is that they're simply not capable of doing it from a technological standpoint. Their systems don't allow it to do that, but they've taken no steps to change the systems.
Now, you referred a moment ago to when you first got to Congress. I believe you and I were both elected in the same year, back in 2010. We arrived here, were sworn into office in our respective chambers in 2011. We had a debt ceiling fight back in 2011. Remember that one?
I do.
Yeah. That one was memorable. One of the many things that was interesting about it, and somewhat memorable that's been brought up here today, is the downgrade, a downgrade that was issued. Do ratings agencies downgrade people for not borrowing enough?
No.
Did they then?
No.
Did they downgrade us specifically because we were not eager to raise the debt ceiling without significant conditions attached to it?
My understanding from reading the report is that the primary reason they downgraded us is we had no plan to fix our fiscal condition going forward. Even though keep in mind, they downgraded us after we cut the deal. So we had raised the debt ceiling and still got the downgrade because they looked at the deal we cut and said, you know what, that's not even close.
So in other words, they weren't satisfied that we had an adequate plan moving forward to reduce overall debt.
And we still don't.
And yet to this day, for the last 12 years, it has become an almost accepted trope, an almost accepted narrative as if it were canonical scripture, that we got downgraded because we were not so eager to increase the debt ceiling that we were willing to increase the debt ceiling without a plan moving forward. In fact, it's quite the opposite of how it's often characterized, isn't it?
It is. In fact, I don't believe that any of the Democrat committees have ever asked the rating agencies to come in and talk about why they gave the downgrade.
Gee, I wonder why that is. Now, there are reasons, of course, why these things matter, because what is it that happens to us if we continue to punt it, if we continue to kick it forward, we continue to increase the debt ceiling, continue to increase the percentage of debt, the debt as a percentage of GDP, without addressing the underlying spending problem? What does that ultimately do? And what does that do to our actual risk of an actual default?
My fear is that the same thing happens to us on debt that has happened to us on modern monetary theory, which you don't hear much about anymore in the last couple of weeks or the last couple of months since we had inflation. Remember that theory that you could just spend as much money as you wanted to and it doesn't make any difference?
I do, and I'll be darned, it turned out not to be true.
It turned out not. It's true until it's not. And all of these theories about, oh, debt to GDP doesn't really make any difference, which Dr. Edelberg has mentioned here today, might be true until it's not. And then what do? Then you're already, we have no plan to get out of the debt. Listen, I have nothing but respect for Mrs. Porter. I served with her for Representative Porter, and she told a wonderful little analogy about her credit card, but I'll bet you there's a significant difference. I bet you she has a plan for how to pay off her credit card. We have none.
Indeed. We do, however, have a plan. We have a plan that was passed by the House of Representatives, a plan that would bring down our debt by $5 trillion over the 10-year budget window, with something in the neighborhood of around $1 trillion, depending on which accounting method you use, a little over or a little under $1 trillion in the first year alone. It would do so in a way that would help us approach this debt issue more responsibly. To date, it is the only plan on the table. It is the negotiation. People say, well, it still needs to be negotiated. Right now, it is the negotiation. Because for 100 days, President Biden refused even to speak to Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy about this, insisting all the time, all the while, that he would take nothing less than a clean debt ceiling increase. Yet another one of the same sorts of things that would predictably lead to a credit rating downgrade. I urge all involved, including and especially President Biden, move forward with this. There is only one plan on the table, and with as late as you've waited, you need to move forward. Let's pass the House-passed bill. Thank you.
Thank you, and I recognize the chairman of the U.S. House of Representatives Budget Committee, Mr. Arrington.
Thank you, Mr. Byer. Just to follow on Senator Lee's closing comments, I don't think it's too much to ask the president, who at one time, as senator and most recently as vice president, negotiated fiscal reforms in a debt ceiling negotiation. I am a little taken aback when people act like this is somehow unprecedented and wring their hands as if we're just completely out of control, or we can't raise the debt ceiling responsibly while dealing with this unsustainable deficit spending and debt. And we've done it. In fact, some of the most significant fiscal reforms have come out of a debt ceiling legislation and negotiations, and it only makes sense. I mean, I really think most Americans say, let me see, debt ceiling, evaluating the indebtedness of our country, its impact on our financial health and our future, and then act responsibly. I'm from Hale County, and we say, Hale. Every American family's doing that, not necessarily because they want to, but because they have to. And they have to more today, my friend, than they have in the past, because their wages and income are shrinking relative to inflation. It's fact that since January of 21, a family of four has lost $13,000 over an entire year. Now, that's over $1,000 a month, and 6 out of 10 Americans live paycheck to paycheck. I don't know how in the world they're doing it. But I think it is quite disconnected. And I appreciate that there are other ways to solve this than maybe the solutions that we've put forward. But to do nothing or to say or suggest that we have to do a clean debt ceiling where it's reckless, is so out of touch with what the American people are having to do to tighten their belts and change their spending habits. That's why 3 out of 4 Americans say, we expect the president and my Democrat colleagues and all political leaders of this greatest country in human history to come to the table and act like adults. I am the proud author of the Limit, Save, Grow Act. I think we have to limit spending by right-sizing a bureaucracy that's 40% bigger than it was in 19. Let's just start there. It's 30% bigger from a discretionary spending perspective than it was going into COVID. CBO said that we'd be spending in 19, before COVID, this year, hundreds of billions of dollars less than we're spending today. We're suggesting we go back 6 months and apocalypse. People aren't buying that, and they're imploring and praying that our leaders come together and do what the House did, which is pass the debt ceiling. One that would pay our bills and protect our good faith and credit while acting responsibly, acknowledging that $10 trillion in 2 years, and again, Republicans have contributed to this problem over the years, and I'm the first to say it, and I'll say it at every meeting for credibility, because it's true. But $10 trillion in 2 years, 6 of which was added to the national debt, a sustained record inflation, soaring interest, nosediving into recession, closer to the precipice of a debt crisis, which we don't know when it hits, but when it does, you can't bail out of that one. Bail out of COVID and other crises. What if we have a war with China? How are we going to borrow the money at 123% debt to GDP when we're paying $600 billion in interest alone, not a single soldier, sailor safety net for seniors, anti-poverty program? That's going to triple in 10 years. In 2 or 3 years, we'll spend more on interest than the entire budget of the Defense Department. If that doesn't make you shudder to your core, and I don't care what your political views are or your affiliation, party affiliation, then you're not reading the same material I'm reading. Mr. Mulvaney, I've said a lot. I just ask you to comment about a debt crisis. We talk a lot about default. We've remedied that with our legislation. Do you worry about a debt crisis down the road at some point that could be catastrophic, maybe irreparable? And I know my time's expired. If the chairman would just indulge the
Short
gentleman.
answer is yes. As the former budget director, it's the thing that keeps you up at night. Again, the comparison to monetary theory holds, which is that, okay, it seems to explain things until it doesn't. And right now, we sort of assume that things are okay until they're not. And when they're not, I don't know what we do, because we've got no plan to get out of debt. Our plan right now is to continue to add to the debt. I think the budget that I wrote in 2018, or maybe the one right after that Russ voted, was the last proposed budget that we expect to balance in 10 years. You'd be hard-pressed to balance the budget right now. You really would. It does worry me that we wake up one morning and people don't lend us money. And when that happens, we will print money because we will continue to want to spend it. And that's inflationary, and that's how great countries fail. And that's what worries me.
I thank Chairman Byer for his indulgence.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Arrington. Let me yield to my friend, Mr. Schweikert, for a few comments while we were waiting for Senator Schmidt to return.
Thank you. Retread Chairman Byer. I don't know if that's polite, but it was meant to be funny. We will be working on, I believe the next hearing will be on the House side. I will work with Chairman Heinrich. We would actually like to have a discussion on some of the primary drivers of U.S. sovereign borrowing. And we have to be honest here, it's healthcare. Substantially, the single biggest input is diabetes. We will also, if we're going to be intellectually honest, we should also talk about some of the latest statistics on obesity in America. You take a look at how many of our brothers and sisters in America are dying early, and how much of that is health. But it's also, there's some back of the napkin math that says it could be the single greatest impact we have on U.S. sovereign debt, income inequality, from some of my tribal groups, is what would happen if we basically spent a decade taking on diabetes, whether it be from the new stem cell potential cure to GLP-1s to the Farm Bill and other things. There are ideas out there, and the beauty of that discussion, we haven't turned that one partisan yet. It's not, is caring about people and, you know, obesity and diabetes, is that Republican or Democrat? At this point, it's just moral. So please, if anyone has input to those of us, please send it our way. Yield.
Thank you, Mr. Schweikert. Now recognize Senator Schmidt for his comments and questions.
Thank you. Mr. Duda Gupta, I wanted to follow up on a couple of things. You know, in your written testimony, it talked about you object to any repeal of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act as ill-advised. Is that accurate?
I think we're talking about the energy provisions.
Yeah.
Yeah, the tax provisions.
Right.
They help, yes, they
Right.
help us achieve our climate goals.
Does that make things more expensive at all? Do you think those sort of onerous regulations on, say, things like dishwashers or refrigerators make those items more expensive?
I'm not familiar with or did not focus on regulations, but the.
Okay, well, let's turn to, because I do want to talk about inflation. So I think there's no way you could argue that the amount of money that we have spent in the last couple of years hasn't contributed to inflation. You would agree with that, right?
I think throughout the world, yes.
Well, no, I'm talking about in the United States. In the federal, in
Right.
this Congress or the previous Congress spending money in the United States, you would agree with that, right?
I think that among other factors, there may have been more demand in the economy than the supply could meet. But in my view, it's the supply that was the challenge, especially in the pandemic,
So spending has helped lead to inflation, correct?
relative to the supply challenges, yes.
Okay. And you mentioned that one of your objections with any work requirements is that we shouldn't do anything to increase hardships. That was your testimony earlier, right?
That's right.
Does the amount of spending that the federal government undertake and thereby inflation, doesn't that lead to a hardship for lower income individuals?
All other things being equal, inflation can be harmful to lower income individuals, but we've also, for the first time in recorded history, completely closed the black-white employment gap and had the lowest unemployment rates in half a century.
Well, I mean, you also mentioned that communities of color are usually first in, or last in, first out, right?
In the labor market, yes.
Right. But I want to stay on the topic of hardship. If things are more expensive for lower income individuals, if milk is more expensive or gas is more expensive, that disproportionately affects lower income individuals. You would agree with that, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge, right, we're facing, that the sheer amount of money that's being spent, and including in the budget that the president has submitted, $7 trillion worth of new spending, $5 trillion worth of revenue. It's deficit spending, number one, but the amount of money that's being pumped into the economy, that and our energy policy, I mean, it's not a tornado or an act of God. Inflation, there's a formula for it, and if you have more expensive energy or less energy, and you're spending trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, that the cost of everything is going to go up. And I appreciate you advocating for, disadvantaged communities. I would think that that's exactly what I'm doing when we make things more expensive like we have.
We just don't want to cause mass unemployment. And of course, the Federal Reserve will respond as prices go up as
Right, well,
it has.
they raise interest rates, which makes things more expensive, right? And so that's one issue. And you talk about employment. I do want to talk about some other policies that have contributed to this, vaccine mandates in particular. We saw millions of people displaced from their jobs from vaccine mandates. And I wanted to we're talking about, the chairman had mentioned previously that we're talking about spending, we're talking about revenue, we're talking about overall economic growth. The idea that we were firing nurses because of vaccine mandates, That certainly didn't help the situation either, right?
For me?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know. It probably protects public health, so that could keep more people able to work and well.
So firing a nurse because she didn't want to take a vaccine, your argument is that protected public health?
That would be the argument for vaccine mandate, yes.
Right, well, okay. Well, I would argue that didn't happen, and we're talking about people who were disproportionately affected. I mean, you're talking about advocating for communities of color, probably had a lower
infected?
vaccination rate, right?
Yes.
Correct. So probably disproportionately more fired because they chose not to take a vaccine, right?
I don't know. It was for particular occupations. I don't know the data, but of course we kept people alive through those mandates.
Okay, all right. I'm not going to get into a COVID debate with you, but I would argue that by forcing 80 million people through OSHA to have a medical procedure or lose your job was COVID tyranny and affected people. We're talking about advocating for people who already find it difficult to afford things by losing their job because they were making that decision. I can't believe that that's the best policy for the United States of America. So anyway, all of these things in a vacuum don't make a lot of sense. The spending is out of control, and I don't hear anything really in your testimony about controlling spending. It's about revenue, and it's about not creating any hardships, but inflation in and of itself has created a hardship.
I have lots of ideas for controlling spending if we have time.
Well, I just want to ask one final question for very quickly. Doctor, there was a scenario laid out before I came back, and I'm the last person to inquire, so I promise I'm going to wrap this up very, very quickly. But we went through this scenario of what happens if I overspend and what happens to the credit rating and that sort of scenario. Do you think, I mean, there's a new proposed rule by the Biden administration to punish people who actually have a good credit rating, who've played by the rules, who didn't go down that road, right? To actually pay more for their mortgage, to subsidize mortgages for people who have lower credit scores. Do you think those are appropriate incentives that we ought to encourage?
I apologize, I'm not familiar with the executive order.
So if you have a good credit rating, you will pay more for your mortgage to subsidize mortgages for people with poor credit ratings. Do you think that's good policy?
So we use housing policy in this country and mortgage policy in this country in all sorts of complicated ways, and part of it is redistributive. Think about the support that we offer to FHA. So I can believe that one of the policies that we would want to incorporate into the enormous federal support for mortgages and home ownership in this country includes redistribution to spur home ownership among lower income communities. That would just be part of a panoply of
Well, it's interesting,
policies.
and I'll close with this. It's fascinating that you're here telling us that, which I agree with, by the way, this idea that we continue to deficit spend, and this is terrible policy, and it's irresponsible. And then later on in your testimony, you're now saying it's actually okay to punish people who've played by the rules to have to pay more for their mortgage. I find that incredibly inconsistent. So I don't have any other questions, Mr. Chairman.
First of all, let me thank you all for being here. I'm eager to fact check the 1 million people that lost their jobs because of vaccine. We don't have to do that today, but
We'll have to do that,
seems-
yeah.
And also, in defense of Dr. Edelberg, that is not what she said. When you asked her about this new rule, she said she didn't know about the rule. I pay great attention. I've never heard of this rule either. This sounds like a QAnon rule, but we will.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, what did it say?
I said that this sounds like a QAnon rule.
Okay,
I've
well,
not heard of this.
unless Joe Biden's a member of QAnon, I would encourage you to look at the rule.
Once again,
Right.
I will look at it.
Sure.
Yeah. And with that, I'd like to thank you for staying through these 2.5 hours to be part of this. The risk to our country well-being couldn't be greater, and millions of American jobs are at risk if we don't solve this, as is our standing with a nation that pays its bills. Congress must act to raise the debt limit. I think we're all in agreement on that. And I'd like to thank each of our panelists for their contribution to this ongoing discussion. And thank you to my colleagues for being part of this discussion, the one who remains. Questions for the record may be submitted after the hearing. The record will remain open for 3 business days, and the hearing is now adjourned.